Thanks so much for coming. It's always incredibly cool to be on a stage here because I grew up coming here for Hebrew school events, among others, and covered David Axelrod and Benjamin Netanyahu and others here, and I think I spot my mom in the audience. And also because this topic of social media and politics is something that's basically shaped my career. I was a blogger back when that felt new and interesting, and then in 2008, 2009 felt kind of the life sucked out of the blogosphere by this new thing, Twitter, and wound up at BuzzFeed really because I sort of felt this shift from this search-based web to social media really affect particularly political reporting very fast. And we have a panel of people who have in different ways also, I think, felt that and reacted to it, who I think will come out as I introduce them. But Rachel Sklar, the first one, is a writer and social entrepreneur based in New York City, and she's the founder of Change the Ratio, which is aimed at increasing the visibility and opportunity for women in tech and new media, and The List, a media company launching soon with the same mission and supported by the Knight Foundation. She injured herself at BuzzFeed's party at one of the conventions, and so she's going to make her way out slowly. It also, I'm not joking. But she also identifies her in here as a former lawyer, which I'm not sure if that's really a thing. I mean, she wasn't disbarred or anything. No. And has written for a really wide range of outlets and was named to the Silicon Alley 100. Empathy.
Oh, thank you.
And the next panelist is Brian Stelter, who's right now a media reporter at the New York Times and somebody a kind of a Twitter must follow, who writes about television and the web, both for the paper and for the blog, the Media Decoder blog. Before joining the Times in 2007, he's very much an entrepreneur and was the founder and editor of TV Newser as a child, basically, which became the preeminent blog about the television news industry. He sold it to Media Bistro back in 2004, and he's now writing a book about morning TV called Top of the Morning, which is due out in May. And the third panelist, Dan Rather, is one of the best-known journalists in the world, who's covered virtually every major event in the past 60 years. Started doing local reporting in Texas on Hurricane Carla, and then moved on to covering the assassination of President Kennedy, the civil rights movement, and a series of global transformations from the war in Vietnam to Iraq. And began as an Associated Press reporter in Huntsville, Texas. He served as anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News from March 9th, 1981 to March 9th, 2005, which was the longest such tenure in the history of broadcast journalism. He also helped found 48 Hours, was a correspondent for 60 Minutes. He has a slightly longer resume than the rest of us up here. And in 2006, he founded the company News and Guts and became the anchor and managing editor of HDNet's Dan Rather Reports, which he now anchors Dan Rather Reports on Access TV, the sort of successor. And it specializes in investigative journalism and international reporting, and he has received virtually every honor in broadcast journalism, including numerous Emmy and Peabody Awards. And here he is.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, welcome, guys. And I guess I thought Brian, I might start with you, and just
the child, I think, is what you said, right?
So yes, well, no, you're no longer a child.
Okay.
When you started, you're
right. Rapidly growing older.
Exactly. He's now elderly. But I guess I wondered, as you watch these political campaigns play out on the social space of Twitter primarily is where the core political campaign, the presidential campaign, is played. I wonder what you see the campaigns using it for, and how you see the campaigns sort of being transformed by this new social media.
Well, it's a megaphone like they've never had before, because they can reach a wider variety of people than they could with their past megaphones, which were doing television interviews, arranging interviews with the media, buying television ads, which are very sort of restrictive in their format. I noticed last week in the debates, and I was struck by what the Obama campaign was trying to do during the second presidential debate. Of course, they had to pump up the message that Obama was back. And so you had campaign staffers within the first few minutes of the debate going onto Twitter and picking Twitter messages that they loved from viewers who were saying Obama's back. But they were also trying to promote a different notion, which I didn't think bubbled up nearly as much during the debate, but they did try at least. It wasn't, without lack of trying. And it was the idea of the real Romney. And they would pick this hashtag, which is a way to organize tweets on Twitter. They would pick the hashtag real Romney. And they would post lots of messages about how Romney was flip-flopping, reversing his position. The message was, we don't know who the real Romney is. And they tried really hard, maybe only moderately successfully, to push that message up. But gosh, they did try. Hundreds of messages with the hashtag Real Romney during the debate. And you could see them trying to change the narrative in real time in a way that we couldn't see that in the past. We couldn't see it online in the past.
Well, I always find it reassuring that the ersatz ones you rarely catch on.
The ones pushed by the campaigns.
Yeah, that it's hard to, you can't just make
the
a meme.
artificial ones, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And Dan, we were talking before, and I was interested in your take on, I mean, as we go through this presidential campaign and this landscape that's been accelerated so much into these, 20-minute news cycles, and also somehow kind of flattened. Every tweet is the same weight, whether it's, what, and kind of I guess you said you thought a little about how this would have played out in earlier political moments, and particularly in Watergate.
Well, during the Watergate time, which is getting to be a long time back, certainly the White House and the Nixon administration would have had a lot of people committed to Twitter, Facebook, social media, everything on the internet, to play defense by playing offense. I have no idea how it would have played out. Would the president have been forced to resign had we had it? My own opinion, clearly labeled, is probably, but that's somewhat tentative, because as Brian just pointed out, the megaphone is much bigger today, and the speed of everything has been so accelerated. Keep in mind, just go back in time, there were 3 networks at that time, only 3 networks at the time. No Twitter, no Facebook, no internet, no cell phones. And so people had to wait for either the morning newspaper or the evening newscast, or possibly during the day some radio. Everything was slower, much, much slower. It would be like seeing Watergate play out in slow motion compared to what it would be today. Now, the power of the presidency, when it sets its mind to it, whether it be Democrat, Republican, or Mugwump, whoever's in power at the time, they can command tremendous resources. So I don't quite know how it would have played out, but I think there's a possibility that they would have been able to play defense by playing offense much more effectively than they were during that time.
I wonder if it would have been obvious how big a deal it was. Because now we see every scandal try to be turned into Watergate by some political party. We're seeing that now with Libya. Whether it is or not a severe scandal, it is trying to be presented that way.
I wonder if we would have that are really scandalous
would still bubble up.
Still bubble up. I mean, I think that, that's one thing that I was struck by on Twitter was when I cover a lot of woman-related issues. And so I'm used to seeing news stories or comments relating to women and reproductive rights sort of bubble up in my feminism stream as part of my Twitter feed, but rarely cross over into the mainstream feed. And when Todd Akin made his comments about legitimate rape, when I first saw that, I actually didn't think it would be a big story because it seemed to me to sort of fall into the category of things that would bubble up in my feminism stream.
Just like the outrage of the day.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of outrage, and there's a lot to be outraged by, but it's hard to get the mainstream, which is the mainstream media is dominated by men, so that's a particular worldview. And you see this playing out that to care as much or take as much of an interest in the minutiae of that particular story. And so to see that cross over into my main Twitter feed was the first clue that I had when all of a sudden all of these men were tweeting and retweeting about Todd Akin. I was like, whoa, dudes care about women's reproductive rights. This is sort of a big deal.
So what makes, I mean, the other story, I guess, very roughly in that space that has crossed over in a big way is Malala, this Pakistani girl who was shot. And in this incredibly crowded news environment, what is it that pulls something out of this kind of flattened, here's another thing, into being? Is it some central decision maker? Is it, executives
Stelter.
at CBS News? Is it somebody with a lot of Twitter followers?
Part of the answer might lie in the digestibility of it. Legitimate rape is a two-word phrase or two-word concept that is very easily graspable, whether we understand what he was saying or not.
Well, we understand how things work in the body.
I think this is a strong point to it, that words still matter. And Mark Twain once said the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between fire and firefly. And as your question of what catches on, legitimate rape, as Brian just pointed out, it's two words. It can be tweeted quite easily, and it can go viral. And it's telling language. It tells a story in itself, if you will, in just two words. I think in this, including myself, too often we are racing to get the tweet up because we want to be the first to do it before we think about wording is still important. What phrases you, what verbs, preferably an active verb that you use, that it still makes a difference. It wouldn't be good writing as described by Mrs. Eleanor Wright, who was my high school writing teacher. But in the modern context, it matters who's writing it, how good a writer they are, what phrases they turn, what verbs they use, in answer to your question of what can catch on. By the way, it occurs to me, you mentioned earlier, I may have a longer resume than most people up on the stage, but I also have a slower mind these days. But one difference in the Watergate era is we didn't have what we have now on radio or on television, nearly as much of people who are on with, quote, news programs, I like to put it in quotation marks, that are not only openly but are proudly biased. One thing, we still were under the old FCC rules, the fairness doctrine, in which if you put on your radio station someone, pick a name, from the right side, you had to put on somebody with equal time, at or about equal time from the left side. And that's a big difference between today.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think, in terms of great writing, I do think, the tweets are the new headline. Right. And there is a lot of, I think wit is kind of winning again in a way.
Imagine what had happened if, when the New York City mayor proposed a soda restriction, which is what he did, we had used the word restriction rather than ban. No one banned soda in this city. He simply put very small restrictions on the amount of the sizes of the certain cups and certain sorts. And yet the media has always used the word ban, and now even the mayor's allies use the word ban. I've never understood it. Although I do know it's a one-syllable word, and the word restriction is a three-syllable word.
Well, another example would be...
It's not a ban. It's the most inaccurate word.
Think of all those characters you're wasting.
Well, another example would be Obamacare, that rather than the original title, Affordable Care Act, which is long, take up half your tweet practically just to say it, Obamacare, the Republicans quite, I think, give them credit. They recognize you need something short, punchy, descriptive, and now even the president himself describes it as Obamacare.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I should add that you can follow Dan Rather at Dan Rather Reports. He assures me he's writing his own tweets. One of the, Brian and I were talking about this a little before, but if you are following the political campaign on Twitter, and particularly if you're reporting on it, your sort of at-reply feed, the people responding to you, is this unending just sort of cavalcade of hate, and often like kind of insane, misspelled hate from one side or the other. And I guess, it's easy to let that demoralize you or threaten you. But I guess I wonder, do you think that's representative of kind of the state of the electorate? Is that just the state of Twitter?
I personally, I was struck by this a couple weeks ago for the first debate on Facebook, where I would type in the word debate just to see what normal people were saying, people like my family, because they're not on Twitter. People like me are on Twitter, reporters are on Twitter, nerds are on Twitter, the political pundits are on Twitter, but my friends are on Facebook. And I was struck by the difference between the two platforms. On Twitter, you had really, really excited people enjoying every moment of the debate. On Facebook, you had angry people, people that were pissed off at both candidates for what they perceived as lies. What I saw on Facebook was cynicism. I don't know which is more accurate, but I have a feeling Facebook was more accurate, closer to the truth.
You did a search in Facebook.
Yeah, just the word debate.
But you were looking on Twitter just in your feed.
I should be clear. I was looking at public posts. So anybody who allows their Facebook to be publicly accessed. And these are just normal strangers. I don't know who they are.
How many people do you follow on Twitter?
2,800 or so.
Okay, so
and it was
like a big
all
sample.
political, but it tended toward the elites, it tended toward the professionals. But then on Facebook, amateurs, they were the ones that just thought everybody was lying. And I don't really see that reflected in the news coverage. So I was wondering, it struck me as interesting that there's this disconnect maybe between the media and the public that may or may not be a lot more angry and cynical than we think.
Well, I think that the regular people that you speak of, the non-professionals in the news industry, now have a platform. Whereas it used to be that if you were angry about something, you wrote a letter to the station or a letter to the editor that you could actually see get published 2 weeks later. Now there's outlets for this, for anything that people feel strongly. And prior to sort of the mass joining of Twitter, for me personally, I would see that in the comment section of the Huffington Post, where I worked during the last election and where I covered the particularly heated contest between President Obama and Hillary Clinton. And as someone who was, let's say, I was less predisposed to be negative towards Hillary Clinton than many people in the news industry, I will say it that way. My coverage was concomitantly more positive. And so I got a lot of angry commentary about, during the height of the Obama and Hillary contest. And I really saw that so much in the comment section of the Huffington Post that I sort of turned off on comments and reading comments and ever looking at comments again. But it inured me to, I guess, it happening on Twitter, because now I don't even really notice. I'm like, all right,
all those crazy people from the comment section all move to Twitter en masse at some point.
Well, it's just, it's access, it's lowering of barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I guess, on that note, I mean, there is an upside to this access and lowering of barriers thing. It's not just for threatening the lives of reporters on Twitter.
No, I would say that seeing that cynicism is a huge benefit if reporters look and if they notice it. And if they recognize that a lot of people think they're all lying anyway, we can improve our coverage for that reason. Right?
But I guess particularly in terms of women in a space that it was long dominated by men, less now than it ever was, certainly on the campaign trail.
Be specific, because there are a lot of spaces.
Political reporting, yes, one of the many. Do you feel like it's been has Twitter been democratizing? Twitter, as the emergence of Twitter as this sort of central stream, has it been democratizing? Has it centralized power? What do you think?
That's it's sort of a complicated answer to that question, because the lowered barriers to access mean a lot of people have that access, right? But there's still the power of the people who are the biggest megaphones and have the most influence, and so who are looked to say, okay, this matters and this doesn't. And you still see overwhelmingly that tends towards men following men, referring men, quoting men. And I think the starkest example of this is there was a Daily Beast article earlier this year that combed through the coverage of women's reproductive rights. I'm coming back to a favorite topic. And noted that 80% of the quotes in newspaper articles about conflicts about women's reproductive rights and access to abortion and contraception were from men. So it's 80% of the experts quoted were men. That's a really stark example. But you can see that in a lot of the coverage. For example, I tweet about this and I Instagrammed it and Facebooked it the other day about Morning Joe, which is the sort of the quintessential political media catch-all, clubhouse, cafeteria, whatever you want to call it. Everybody tunes in and sees who's on. And the lion's share of people sitting around that table are men. And then there's Mika and the occasional regular who was a woman. But it's still overwhelmingly, I did a little count and it was 14 guests, 1 woman, 12 guests, 1 woman, 13 guests, 1 woman. That's about the split. And so that carries over to social media in terms of who follows who. And I think one of the main differences about Twitter, when you talk about what you see in your stream in Twitter, is that you make an active choice to follow people on Twitter. So everything that comes into you only comes into you by your choice, or if one of the people you follow has retweeted someone else. That's the only way that it will get into your feed and you will see it. So what's interesting about your perception of what is buzzworthy is directly dependent on who you're following. Because if there's a hashtag exploding somewhere and you don't follow any of the people in that sector, you won't see that, that thing bubbling up, and it'll take you by surprise. So it's complicated because there have been definitely opportunities for new voices to break in through social media, and we've definitely seen that happen. But there are still entrenched power structures that linger and sort of come over, and then now as more and more social media has become more and more establishment, that blends. So it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, you see it it's funny, I agree. Like, you sort of see it become professionalized in a way with a lot of the, reporters for the New York Times, for instance, are the ones with the biggest megaphones, the most Twitter followers in their space. But then at the same time, there are folks like, I don't know, Stephanie Newell, if you ever bounce off her on Twitter, @EmoKidsLoveMe. This paralegal in Newell, Georgia, who will occasionally, I guess I've got the town wrong, who will occasionally tweet at Jake Tapper and get him to correct something, and just very astute TV watcher who pushes people and gets them and engages them. I don't know, what do you think? Is this a democratization, or is this just sort of a, throwing news to the wolves?
I think it's democratization. I take Rachel's points. It's not perfect democratization, but I think unquestionably it has democratized the whole media landscape, if you will, to a far greater degree than it ever was before. Before we move too far along, I want to make one sort of footnote bottom of the page, that in political coverage, unless one works with an institution such as the New York Times, and there are very, very few of them around, that has large staffs, that they can set aside an investigative unit, if you will, that reporters now in the field covering the campaign, the pressures on them, they have a deadline every nanosecond. Not to mention rockets from the home office. Can you match so-and-so? Or did you see this tweet? How do we match up with this? And so what it used to be, a New York Times reporter covering the campaign trail, he could spend his day checking with sources, maybe even getting off the trail itself to talk to some consultant or what have you, because he had to file by maybe 2:30 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, perhaps even later, for the next day's paper. In today's world, that no reporter on the campaign trail can do that. They're busy tweeting, doing their Facebook, answering rockets from the office, getting ready to do even a video. The home office wants a video once or twice an hour. So I think the public needs to understand what the pressure is on those reporters. And as I say, with few exceptions, it leads to less real reporting than it does just aggregating, sort of reporting off Twitter, Facebook, what the campaign's putting out on their Facebook page, to say nothing of the tweets. It's something we have to understand, that this pressure on reporters, the Times probably has, 3 or 4 reporters on each candidate right now, I would say. But most newspapers, most television stations that even have reporters, and given the contraction in the business, there are far fewer of them out there, they have far less time now than they've ever had to do real reporting.
I think, kind of what we at least noticed and tried to take advantage of at BuzzFeed was that there was this, there was a market for original reporting that wasn't being served. Nobody wants a tweet that said, the 30th tweet of what the candidate said, but a scoop will go far, and that there's, in a weird way, there's less competition for scoops than there's ever been.
It's interesting to look at where we've seen some of the most notable videos, and we saw the 47% video about Romney come from Mother Jones, a leftist or left-leaning publication. We saw Fox News make a big deal out of an old video that Tucker Carlson found of Obama speaking about redistribution.
He refound it.
Refound it, that's right.
He aired it in 2007.
And it wasn't Fox News that found it, it was Tucker's site, the Daily Caller. It's almost as if these big media companies are increasingly going to act as, have feeders out there from the Daily Callers of the world or the Mother Jones of the world. They're going to do the reporting, as partisan as it may be, and then it'll bubble up into these old line institutions, which have fewer reporters to do the work. It's an interesting, more complex environment, I guess. What amazes me is that these things these days seem like fireworks. Something like legitimate rape pops higher than, it goes up higher in the sky than ever before, and then disappears. If you had said to me last year, in October 2011, that we were going to have presidential debates and never hear the word Occupy, I don't think anybody in this room would have believed it. Occupy was the biggest story of the war country in the fall of 2011, and we don't hear about it. It was a firework, this giant firework that has disappeared. And there's many others like it. The Tea Party is another example. I think we may have heard it once in a debate, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've barely heard about the Tea Party this year.
You didn't hear it once at the Republican National Convention.
What a huge firework. And we didn't hear about Afghanistan either. We could argue the wars have been a firework. There are lots of things that have popped up and then just vanished.
Right,
and maybe that's social media's fault to some degree, because it's easy to be distracted on the web.
Yeah, that's what I sort of wondered about Watergate. Things now burn so hot and so fast. It's like he would have either resigned within the first week or not at all? I mean, it seems like there's this acceleration.
Or
Well, maybe
someone
a
would've-
little more than the first week, but
Right.
I take your point. We've had the acceleration of information, and so it probably would have come to a head. That's an excellent point. Probably would have come to a head far faster than it did. It really was 2.5, 3 years in the making. In today's environment, in the digital age, maybe a week to a month at most.
Maybe it would have never happened at all because maybe Mark Felt would have been nervous that someone would see him and Bernstein in the parking lot and snap a photo and send it to Instagram, which pushes to Twitter and Facebook and Flickr and Foursquare.
Or
So-
maybe he would have created his own Twitter account anonymously.
that's
I mean, I would suspect any time that would happen these days, people would go directly to the public. There's such a decrease in the role of mediator by reporters. There's such a decrease in the role of gatekeeper that I would expect the source to go on.
Although the person who had that 47% video tried very hard to do that.
True.
Very kind of, I guess, sort of
True.
ineptly, but they had a Twitter account where they were for weeks tweeting at reporters, check out this
Right.
video. They had posted it to Daily Kos, which used to be a place people went. This thing was just floating out there until
That's interesting.
Until kind of a respected voice like put their stamp of approval on it and called it a scoop,
Right.
and
Right.
then it went everywhere. And I guess, do you think? I mean, I wonder if, as a reporter, in reconstructing events, private events, secret events. I mean, is there stuff on Twitter that we're missing?
I'm shocked now. I'm working on a book about morning television, and I'm trying to reconstruct what's happened in the last 2 years. And I'm struck by how much is online that, in retrospect, were clues for my story. Like things, meetings that were tweeted about, like people present together at dinners and stuff. And it's all online if I find it now, but I didn't know at the time. I didn't know what I was looking at. If you look at Ann Curry's tweets before she was fired, she was dropping hints left and right that she was being pushed out of her job. We just didn't know because we didn't know she'd be. So it's interesting to look back. You can see hints all the time now on these sites, and who knows what hints are being dropped right now that we just don't know are hints. It's a fun puzzle for people to put together after the fact.
Well, this is where the fire hose of information comes in. One does have that feeling you're close up to a very high pressure fire hose, so much coming to you. And I find with myself, pardon the personal reference, that I have to discipline myself to find time to say, stop, get off Twitter, get off Facebook, get off reading, get off filing, and think. Because if you're not careful, you can go through a full day by the time you answer whatever's on your iPhone and whatever else you have to do, and never have any time to think. And that leads to, as you say, there's a lot of material there, but it's all coming at you as such a rush, and there's so much of it that it's pretty hard to separate the proverbial wheat from chaff.
We may be the only addicts on stage here of social media, but for any in the audience, I heartily recommend telling your significant other to change your password. Because I did that for the month of September, and it was a godsend. I had her change my password on Twitter and Facebook.
We missed you on Twitter, though.
But I didn't miss it. I thought I would, and I didn't. It was wonderful. And I will do it again whenever I need to now. Take a break from it all.
With the election a couple weeks away, I mean, I wonder, which side do you think is better at social media this cycle? I mean, in 2008, there was this obvious sense that the Obama campaign was really like a generation ahead, partly because it was representing people who were generationally online in a way McCain's supporters
And
were.
it was going to win in a landslide, as it turned out.
And he was winning, and his supporters were excited. I mean, there are times when it really feels like conservatives are better at Twitter, or kind of winning Twitter. I don't know. What do you think?
Again, that depends who you follow. I have not noticed that, but that's not really dominant in my stream. So I noticed very early on that the Obama campaign was getting good at social media when the Barack Obama Tumbler emerged, and I started seeing material tweeted from them, and they retweeted a picture of Amy Poehler as Leslie Knope from Parks and Rec, who, if anybody watches that fantastic show, she plays like a small town government official. And they tweeted back to someone who had posted that, asking for basically for engagement, and they engaged. And I was like, that is smart, because I saw that get blogged and reblogged all over Tumbler, which we actually haven't talked about. And so, I mean, there's experts, there's real experts who have been working on the Obama campaign for the past 4 years and trying to stay ahead of the curve. But it's hard for me to assess that, again, because I have looked. I've gone to the Romney site I went just earlier today, actually, because I saw an LGBT video from the Obama campaign where Tyler Ferguson, I'm making a lot of TV references, sorry, from Modern Family, like got all choked up thinking about his past and being bullied. And I went to see if there was anything similar on the Romney site, and I couldn't find anything.
Shocker.
But you know, it's that sort of thing. It's like there was a video about around Mother's Day around Anne Romney that actually was a fantastic video, really like warm, winning portrait of her. And then a few days later, actually, I run this listserv of women. I was going to send it out to the listserv, and I looked for it, and I couldn't find it. It had just been sent out, but when I went to the Romney site, it wasn't easily discoverable. So it's, I mean, in my personal experiences, I do live online, so there is that. I have not actually noticed that the Romney campaign has been as good at pan social media as the Obama campaign. But you know, there's no question that there's like two separate worlds out there online, and the internet is basically divided, and half the people are, you know, on one side and half the people are the other. So who knows what I'm missing?
No question that the Obama campaign had the best of it in the 2008 election. But as, forgive the sports analogy, but as in football, when somebody invents a new offense, it takes the defense a little time to catch up, and the defense frequently catches up and even leapfrogs over it. I think that's what's happened in this 2012 election. The Republicans got stung. They were laggard the last time. They saw the results of that the last time. Now, who has done best this campaign, we'll know the morning after the election who's done the best job. But I would say the Republicans have at least caught up with the Obama campaign, and perhaps, depending on how the election turns out, maybe they've even surpassed them.
Yeah, there's this kind of online energy, I think, from some conservatives that reminds me at least of the really frantic energy around Obama in 08.
Is there somebody like that is like a really good ambassador on Twitter that you can think of?
I'm sure good ambassador is the word, but the whole kind of like Breitbart world,
Right.
which is very focused on working the refs, on pushing reporters, on calling out reporters, you know, sometimes accurately, but often insanely, is something that Obama's supporters did a lot of in 2008. And I think like this sense of a mild demoralization, or at least people are not as inspired as on the left as conservatives are angry right now, and I think that sometimes kind of
Well,
shows
you saw an
through.
example of that with however one feels about it, one way or the other. When Candy Crowley, the moderator, stepped in, there was an immediate orchestrated campaign to discredit her. I'm not saying there weren't plenty of people who on their own objected to it, but you could tell once you got on Twitter and other places on the social network, almost instantly a campaign. This woman was out of line, she never should have done this, so forth and so on, trying to grab the narrative for the next day. If you're in the Republican, that is the Romney camp, you're saying, okay, our guy may not have done all that badly in the debate, but he didn't have the kind of victory he had the last time, so we need to take the focus somewhere, and Candy Crowley was a handy focus.
Although I think you could tell how orchestrated it was, because at some point late that night they decided it wasn't working, they pulled the plug, and it just vanished.
Exactly.
Like it wasn't like organically continuing.
Well, there's been I was about to call this fun, but it's not fun. There's been an interesting game of preparation to discredit each of the moderators, just in case the sides don't like them. So you'll see Martha Raddatz before the vice presidential debate. There were stories about her having attended a wedding where Barack Obama attended the same wedding. You know, we had these stories come out, and after the fact, there was not a lot of criticism of Martha Raddatz. But if there had been, people could have pointed to those pre-stories. I think didn't someone at BuzzFeed call it pre-spinning? There was a term
the pre-wash.
It was
Yeah.
a pre-wash
It's
of each of the moderators.
before the spin
and
cycle.
we haven't seen it start yet for Bob Schieffer, but there are still 24 hours for it to happen, for someone to put out something just in case they don't like Bob Schieffer's performance.
Now, you mentioned Tumbler. People, you know, I'm sure as you're sort of like figuring out the social media landscape, and I'm sure people are on various different, you know, sets of platforms, but along with Facebook, which is this very broadcast platform that, you know, hundreds of millions, or I guess tens of millions of Americans, hundreds of millions of Americans?
I think hundreds of millions.
Which is like all of them are, you know, are on. Twitter, a much narrower kind of verticalized space where people, experts and obsessives in these certain topics, are going to argue. And then there's Tumblr, which to me sometimes feels like, you know, it's like kind of the internet's internet these days. It's where a lot of these memes are kind of born and created. I mean, do you think? I mean, you mentioned that. Do you think is that where people should be if they want to know what's really going on?
Like anything else, it really depends. I'll push back a little bit on what's been floated here, that Twitter is only for sort of experts and people who are really into it. That Twitter is a vast, vast world of people. It is now, it is very mainstream, and if you see sort of like, I mean, as an example, one of the biggest nights for Twitter was when Beyonce came on stage during an award show and revealed her baby bump. So it's not just, it's for a lot of people who care about a lot of things. So Tumblr, in the same way, you follow other people, so that you have like a dashboard that shows you your stream of who you're following. And it is a very simple blogging platform where you can very easily post photos and videos, text, links, or you can see other things that come from your screen, your feed rather, and you can just very simply reblog them the same way you would retweet. So I think where you have, again, you have like certain people who have massive followings and who really engage in the space. And so you can push something to Tumblr and people will find it. The other thing is it's searchable when you do a search in Google, so it'll come up and win SEO. So I think that, you know, I don't see, I see the sort of the news of the day, the political news of the day coming up in Tumblr when I look at it, but I do still go straight to Twitter when I want to know what's going on. Like that is the first place I go. I definitely check Facebook. I definitely get good longer form articles from there. But when I want to take the pulse, I still go to Twitter.
Yeah, Tumblr, if you do want to find like a photoshopped image of binders full of women,
Right.
30 seconds after Mitt Romney has used the phrase, though.
And I love that Facebook, like Tumblr, is where those frequently originate. And then I find I often see them on Facebook because they pop up in my feed. I was struck by what did Obama say about it was the binders full of women. The pictures of Clinton with the Photoshop. What about these binders full of women? You know, with Clinton's eyes bald. Those photos that popped up the next morning were hilarious. Were hilarious, and I saw them on Facebook because that's where he bubbled up. You know, what I'm worried about with all these platforms is that, as you said, these are these verticals that exist. You know, these silos of people on all of these sites. I wonder, and I don't mean to endorse this idea at all, I just wonder if it needs to happen. You talked about the fairness doctrine earlier. Should there not be a fairness algorithm? Should I not be forced to see a liberal story if I've seen 5 conservative stories on my Facebook feed? If my friends are only sharing conservative stories, shouldn't I have to at least have the opportunity to see one liberal story, or vice versa?
Well, you know, that actually exists in the flip. Eli Pariser talked about in his book, The Filter Bubble, which is that you are more like now with all of these customized news feeds, you can customize them yourself, or they're customized for you. You know, the cookies saved in your computer will tell Google what you ought to be seeing, and so you get a very different result than someone in a red state. Or I mean, when I say you, I don't mean specifically anybody in this audience.
It's something that I just worry about. I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know what the wrong answer is. But I do know that people like me, we all purposefully follow blue state people and red state people. I purposely follow Europe and Asia. I follow your rural and urban. I follow rich and poor because I know that otherwise my Twitter feed is going to not reflect the full diversity of the country. I don't think my brothers follow people on Twitter the same way. I know they don't. They do follow lots of politicians. I'm proud of their diversity. I looked at their feeds. But I wonder about how we encourage more of that, if we should or not. More importantly, I wonder how Facebook and Twitter could.
You know, that just may turn out to be a central question as we move forward in this digital age era. That with a newspaper worthy of the name, even if you didn't read the articles, if you said, I want to just read the sports page, you had to thumb through some pages where there'd be a headline about Libya. Right. There might be 2 contradictory columns in the paper. You got exposure to other points of view. You weren't in a strict silo, and I like the metaphor of the silo. It's something we've lost as newspapers fade, the New York Times accepted, but newspapers in general fade, because there's the ability now to hear only what you want to hear. That you say, listen, I like this site because they reflect what I already think, what I already feel. I'm going to stick with this site. These are the people I'm going to listen to. Somewhat the same with television, that you choose your channel saying, I like these people because politically they agree with me, where ideally you switch around the dial. But the thing is, with television, you can switch around the dial and do it. I don't know, like you, I don't know how we do this. What you suggested earlier, being forced to, would run head-on with the First Amendment. Of course. But there must be a way to at least encourage people to get some diversity in where they go.
Yeah, I was at an event not long ago where somebody suggested to Eric Schmidt that Google be indexed by truth, and that there'd be something in the algorithm that pushed true things higher. And he thought that was kind of a barrel of worms. And yeah, I think one of the things we find in the social media in particular is one of the pressures. It's not just to customize what you're looking at, but also that there's certain kind of things people aren't comfortable sharing with the broad group of friends that they have, which often includes college friends, high school friends, family, people with different views. Right. So often there's sort of like politics, sex, religion, are actually things you often don't want to discuss at all in that space, sort of edgy political topics. You're concerned that you'll alienate somebody, or then our Facebook feeds may have a lot of politics because, but we're probably exceptional in that way. People typically do not share anywhere near as much politics as they do.
Nor are we
less
scoring. We're not
things.
Voting the way that people would vote on Facebook.
Right.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
actually can't vote. I'm Canadian. So.
We knew that when you said
I was just about to say a boot, if you didn't capture that. And I guess before we switch to, as I work through this stack of questions, what do you think it means for us, this shift for those of us who still work in the mainstream media, or I guess do I count? I'm not sure. But in the
I think you've mainstreamed pretty fast.
In the professional media, are we? Do you feel that we've been kind of disempowered by these social feeds?
I think actually quite the opposite. If this was a conversation we were having in 2009, it would be very different. 2009 is pretty much where Twitter started to tip towards the mainstream. There was like the race between Ashton Kutcher and CNN to get 1 million followers. Now people like Rihanna have 13 million followers. And then Oprah joined Twitter in April 2009. And then so one by one you saw all of the media people saying okay, it's time to join Twitter, as opposed to saying I don't care what you had for lunch. And so now pretty much everyone is on Twitter, has a Twitter presence, is on Instagram, is on Facebook. You see people directing people straight towards Facebook for campaigns. Like movies will now, when you see a trailer on TV, it'll have the Facebook address. So these things are now very mainstream, which means that the old school entrenched media with the money, the access, and the power were able to get their land grab and establish themselves. So, and that's also part of what the kind of content that's pushed out, right? So when I see a clip from TV, it's on YouTube, which makes it easily shareable, but it's probably going to be something, outrageous from Fox and Friends, or something from, Lawrence O'Donnell saying he's going to challenge Tag Romney to a fight, or something from Morning Joe or whatever. I mean, so it's still, you're still seeing content created by the mainstream, and of course, articles from the New York Times, and now very often, stuff from BuzzFeed, or with the little BuzzFeed watermark on the video in the corner.
We'll take it.
So I think that these are becoming essentially a bigger distribution network for the mainstream in a lot of different ways.
For sure. And so we have a lot of questions from the audience, all of them for Dan Rather. Sorry. And with this one, I thought I'm also curious. Do you think Candy Crowley's intervention was appropriate in that debate?
I do. I absolutely do. I think it would have been inappropriate if she hadn't done it. Why else would she be there? Just to be a timekeeper, you don't need a journalist. In theory, the reason they wanted journalists there is to be an honest broker between two partisans. No, I think she was absolutely right. I have no truck at all with the criticism of her that she should have, quote, kept her mouth shut, not said anything. That I think there's been too little of it in the past, quite honestly, and I applaud her for it.
Another question for Dan that I will broaden out a little, but one of the things that really hasn't been transformed by the social web is TV, the evening news, either in its content or in its distribution. I think television is much more traditional at this point than text, and then other forms of news. And I think, but I think that people think that's changing quite fast. And do you see changes rapidly, both technological and also in terms of social distribution?
Absolutely, both cases. And it will probably come sooner than we think, as opposed to later than we think. That television, as we now know it, I think is the old order. Now, the new order is not completely in place. It's what the Catholic Church calls an interregnum. I'm not a Catholic, but it's a handy phrase, interregnum. The old order is virtually gone. The new order is not fully in place. And I think it's a dangerous place for journalism in this interregnum, if you will. But I'm an optimist by nature and by experience. And I think whatever comes, there'll be, I don't know what it would be, but there'll be something beyond Twitter. It's just out there over the horizon. And we maybe in a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years or less, we'll be talking about Twitter in the past because some new form will come up. But in answer to your earlier question, or maybe what you discussed a bit earlier about where does that leave us, I think it has empowered us. But with that power comes a great responsibility. I'm not here to preach a journalism course. But as long as journalists, enough journalists take the view, we are here to be an honest broker of information for the consumers, then whatever wild new future we're moving into, I think journalists will feel more empowered, not less. And if we can keep our idealism intact, we'll be just fine, and so will consumers.
Gosh, wouldn't it be nice if all television came with a warning sticker on it? Every channel, every program. Red would mean this is partisan and we all know it. And green would mean we're at least trying to tell the truth. We're at least trying to be fair.
Right.
So much of it is, it's hard to, for a normal viewer, hard to tell the difference.
You may be onto something there. The movies, it doesn't work very well, but they rate the movies.
They
PG,
do.
PG-13,
They do.
PG-16. But I want to pursue this thought a little bit because it's a good idea. You could ask the channel or the place on the internet, you choose what, do you want to be red? We are biased toward the Republican Party. Or do you want to be blue? We're biased toward the Democratic Party. You want to be green? Look, you can fault us, but we're trying to be down the middle. And then have that up on the set, and then have the viewer make up their mind whether that they are what they say they are.
Right.
I'm sure that would totally fly.
I'm not either.
I'm
Yes,
just,
I think,
I'm
I
just
think
up here dreaming.
Most of them do like to, I think, see themselves as fair and balanced. So.
You say that. I mean, it's an easy joke, and we all use it, right? But Fox has done something very interesting in recent years. It has moved. It frequently asserts itself not as being fair and balanced, but as the balance, dropping the D, the balance to the rest of the media. And they, once in a while, hosts will acknowledge that. Frequently, you'll notice it on the coverage because the guests do tend more to be on the conservative side. They did. The best example here is the 9 p.m. hour on Fox News. Sean Hannity and Alan Colmes were the hosts before the presidential election in 2008. One host that was Democrat, one that was Republican. One may have been louder than the other, but they were balanced. And then Colmes left. Hannity was the only host. Now the show is unbalanced.
And when you
Fox
talk to
has become
viewers,
more of a balance to the media and not fair and balanced. Although they use the slogan, and they do have journalists, they do have objective journalists, we should make that very clear. They've tried to become more of a balance, and I find that interesting because it's a shift in the television waters.
And MSNBC, at least in their primetime hours, try to be the counterbalance.
Right. So all of this is really video now. It's not really television. And I think to answer the question about where television's going, I would suggest that as we have more video in the world, and we'll take the 47% video as an example, or the Obama speech in 2007 as an example, we're going toward a world of more primary sources. And I think that's a great thing for television and for video, to have more primary sources, primary documents. Let's take something that hasn't been talked about in the debates this year, and it's drone warfare. It's drone strikes. So we haven't heard, we may hear more about tomorrow night during the foreign policy debate. But imagine in 4 years when we have more cell phone cameras in developing countries, we have more videos of drone strikes. We have more cell phone videos of the casualties from drone strikes. Maybe that would force it into the national debate. Maybe more video, maybe even live video from the tribal areas of Pakistan would give us more visibility into these events and thus cause the candidates to talk about them more.
Or maybe
not, but
maybe a enterprising news channel would say, wow, there was so much information, you're going to need us to go through it all and package it up into a really convenient and digestible 22 minutes for you at the end of your day. The pendulum swings.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I wonder what happens when we have more of those primary sources, because even though we think we have a lot, we're still very early on in that trend. Tornadoes these days are filmed by a few people, but seen by hundreds. As we have more and more video from these events, especially things that are hard to cover, like the environment or education, things that don't lend themselves to television coverage, I wonder what happens. I don't know. Maybe we'll just get desensitized to it all, and things won't change at all. But I wonder what happens in that environment.
And is there such a thing as the evening news in that remade video space?
I have my doubts. you're talking about the survivability of the evening news as we now know it. I have my doubts. This is not likely to happen day after tomorrow, but I could see one of the so-called big three networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, deciding at some point we're going to trade that time with our local stations for some other time, and one will get out and then another will get out. I'd be surprised if all three got out anytime soon, but I can foresee a future where it's a thing of the past. Perhaps one network will have an early evening newscast, and the others will say, tune us in at 10 o'clock at night rather than at 6:30 or 7.
Do you watch the evening news, just out of curiosity?
Gosh, I haven't watched it.
Does it go on in the BuzzFeed office? I know you guys all have TVs.
No, never.
Well, this has to do with their survivability as well, that their audience is, by and large, is an older audience. It's very difficult to find anybody under the age of, let me just pick, say, 35, who has
If
seen...
you had just said 40, I could have said,
Because you still watch,
Wait,
right?
so you're saying,
I do.
so why do you watch the evening news?
No, that I've seen
Kevin,
anybody's evening newscast anytime soon.
Do you watch it as a consumer, or do you watch it to like see what those other people are watching?
no, I've DVR'd the evening news for years and years, and it used to be because I was a full-time media reporter, but for me now, I just like to catch up. I mean, I'm puttering around my apartment. I would DVR a lot. Like I DVR Charlie Rose. I DVR, clearly I DVR Parks and Recreation. But yeah, I watch the evening news.
Which one?
NBC. Sorry.
Had to ask. Another question, which I think must be for you, Rachel, which is, can you comment on the laws in Canada, of which I was unaware, that protect the democratic process by barring propaganda? Is this a real thing?
I mean, I actually really can't. I haven't lived in Canada for 14 years, so I actually can't really comment on any of this as a consumer, because when I was a kid growing up, I just wasn't into news. I was no Brian Stelter.
Lucky.
Child blogger.
So the only thing, I mean, I know that there was some law about no tweeting about elections on election day or something, but that seems ridiculous. So I'm so sorry, I can't actually comment on Canada. I can say that there are a lot of great Canadians in the news business, but...
God, I was under the misimpression that you were up here to tell us about Canada. I'm sorry, Rachel.
So sorry.
And here's, I think we have 5 or 10 more minutes here, and this was sort of a good broad final question about this sort of totally transformed media, which is how do you know who to believe? Do you want to take that one? Brian?
We could start by saying that we could start by taking Newsweek magazine as an example here. Closing down in print, surviving online. And it may have been Andrew Sullivan that made this point, or it may have been someone making the point about Andrew. I don't remember. But someone pointed out that when we move to the web, institutions become less important and individuals become more important. And Andrew Sullivan is an example of that, because he, about a decade ago, prioritized his blog, focused on his web presence, writes for the magazines sometimes, has had cover stories in Newsweek, but focuses on his blog for the Daily Beast. I suppose who we're going to believe in the future are individuals that we believe. Hopefully there will remain a role for institutions like the New York Times. I think there will be. I know I've benefited just as much from the Times as the Times, much more than they benefited from having me or any other single reporter there. The institution is what gives me credibility to pick up the phone and call sources. But the role of the individual is going to, I think, keep growing. And the individuals who seem trustworthy to a lot of people are going to win in those forums.
I think it'll be much the same as it is now in that regard, that the keys to becoming trusted are authenticity, and these days, giving the digital era, a conversation. If you are authentic and you're willing to have a conversation with your audience, an ongoing conversation with the audience, then as an individual, or for that matter, an institution, an organization, you'll get your share of followers. But to the basic question of, how do you know whom to trust now? You trust your own head and heart and instincts. Over a period of time, my recommendation for whatever it may be worth, which is probably not very much, is watch a person or go to a news site and over a reasonable length of time ask yourself, are they at least trying to give it to me straight up, no chaser, so far as it's humanly possible to squeeze their own bias and prejudice out of it? That's the site I would go to. That's the person I would listen to. I'm not saying everybody would do that, But that's a litmus test. But this is the same way in television, that a Walter Cronkite or a Jack Chancellor got to be trusted because people saw them over a period of time, not being perfection, making their mistakes, but over a period of time saying, you know what, I think I can trust that person. Which, by the way, is where I think the presidential election will be decided. In the end, it's whom do you trust with the future of the country the most?
Well, I think it's very interesting that we have gotten through this entire discussion without talking about Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert, who right now rank up as high as any news source with trustworthiness. And I think one of the reasons that they have reached that point is not just because it's packaged with humor, because then it would just be a funny show and not a news show. They really are news shows. And that's because they actually do look at both sides and pull in. They expose the underside. They expose when people get it wrong, and when people obfuscate, when they talk out of both sides of their mouth, when they apply a differing set of standards to one fact pattern and side of the aisle than to another. And so those are things that make you feel like they're being fair and balanced, to borrow a phrase. So I think that like extrapolating that out a little bit further to general consumption is sort of to borrow from Reagan, which is trust but verify. Find someone who you trust, but you know what? Don't just take in from one source. If you are going to take in from one source, make sure that that source is itself taking in from other sources so that you can see what's going on across the spectrum.
Very strong point, because I think one reason that they're trusted, and I think both of them are, is that they send out a constant signal: we play no favorites, we pull no punches. Now, a partisan political operative on one side or another might say, oh, I think Jon Stewart is all Democratic or what have you. But that's the key to getting trusted among people who want news, real news, as opposed to propaganda or somebody's slant. Do they pull no punches? Do they play no favorites? And that's where a large section of the audience will go, as they have gone in those two instances.
I think part of the answer here does lie in that idea of primary sources, which is a version of what you're saying about verifying. I remember in 2000, maybe it was 9, when the birther movement had a renewed sense of steam. There was more talk about President Obama's birthplace, but he hadn't come out and released the record he did last year. I remember that what convinced me was the document in the Honolulu newspaper with his birth announcement. I didn't care if an anchor told me it was true. I didn't care if an email chain told me it was untrue. I cared that I could see a document that I believed, which was, well, how's it going to get in a newspaper? So I think for me it was that. For me it was the primary source, and that's what I verified with. And at least we have those. Whenever I get so frustrated by the people that believe the lies around this election on any side, how 6 sides, whatever, at least we have elections still. At least we can't. I mean, I know people are gonna dispute some of the results in a few weeks, and there will probably be scattered instances of something, but at least we still have elections. At least we can all agree on the final result in a few weeks.
And I do think actually there's been around, just to finish up, because I think one of the many things that's going to make people totally insane for the next 2 weeks is the prospect of a repeat of 2000.
Right.
And something that's so close that the winner is deprived of legitimacy. And I think you saw this in Wisconsin in these contested elections, that it's so transparent. All of the information is immediately shared, and there's some kind of corrective and common conversation going on around. Somebody makes some claim about Waukesha County, and they're immediately experts in Waukesha County in that conversation, at least saying something, wielding whatever authority they have. I don't know, but yeah, good luck to everybody in staying sane for the next couple of weeks. and thank you all so much for being on this panel. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.